Hello everyone. This is Umar Qureshi and Tammy. We both are again with you on at Talk Live with UQ and Tammy. UQ is me myself, Umar Qureshi, and today we have a wonderful guest with us. But before we move on to guest and Tammy introduces you, what is the topic of today's show and how we are going to, and who is the guest with us and how what questions do we have? Let me tell you, this show is the collaborative project of Pakistani ASCD and ELASCD, and we bring the best voices from the education sector from the world for you to discuss the wonderful ideas, discuss the wonderful practices, and we ask the guests to share their experiences with us. So stay with us, and what have we have a channel on YouTube as well. So if you have missed our previous shows and you want to watch the shows, go to YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and you will watch the wonderful people with us. And one of those amazing people, again, today we have a wonderful educationist with us. Can you tell us who is with us? And hi to you.
Hi, yes. Hi, Umar. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us today. Sorry about the time difference confusion. It happens to us sometimes, but all is good. Thanks for joining us. Today we have Tom Hoerr, who's a PhD, but retired from his New City School in St. Louis, Missouri, where he was for 34 years and is now the head of school at Emeritus. So he also is a scholar in residence at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. No big deal there, of course, and teaches in the educational leadership program, preparing and working with prospective principals. And you've got a lot of stuff going on. There's quite a list here.
That's enough. I mean,
that's a lot.
I'm old enough that I've done a lot.
And you've written the way that we met was through one of the books that you had written, the Formative Five. I saw you do a keynote and workshop in Dubai a couple of years ago. And you've got your leadership or educational leadership, the principal connection column, and that's been running for quite a number of years. And I know it's a very valuable resource. So thank you very much for joining us today, Tom.
I'm glad to be here.
And thanks for joining us on, I know it's Memorial Day long weekend in the US. So you have hopefully an extra day of some rest and whatever you need to do this weekend. So let's get right into our questions because we have quite a number of them. So some of the work a lot of the work that you've done is around through the lens of multiple intelligences. And so I like to know where people kind of start their journey. And so I was wondering, where did your interest in the idea of multiple intelligence stem?
Well, in back in the 80s, I read Howard Gardner's book, Frames of Mind. And that was the classic book in which he sets out the theory of multiple intelligences. And as I read it, what really came home to me is we talk a lot about curriculum, and I believe curriculum is important. But too often, I think schools are curriculum-centric in the sense that if a kid fits the curriculum well, she's really bright. And if she doesn't, well, it's her problem. MI, in contrast, was very kid-centric. I said we all have different intelligence strengths. We all learn in different ways. So the thought of framing a school around multiple intelligences was really exciting to me. Turned out there had been a school that had done that, the Key School in Indianapolis. They were the first school in the country. They were about 2 years ahead of us. But I came back, this is again 1988. My faculty got really pumped. I formed a book group because however good my ideas are, they aren't as good as the ideas of the collective. And we began reading Frames of Mind chapter by chapter. And when we read it, we used the intelligence that was discussed. So when we read the musical intelligence, for example, the teachers who presented that to the group did it relying on song and note and music. When we did the logical mathematical chapter, the teachers who presented it, did it in puzzles and word games. And it was fun to learn that way, but it also reminded me of ways in which I'm not smart. And it was a good reminder that we have kids who come to school who have real strengths, but school doesn't reach them. So we began implementing MI in 1988, and we still to this day I'm retired, as Tammy said, but the New City School, St. Louis, Missouri, is still a multiple intelligence school. And up through the 90s, until really No Child Left Behind, we had hundreds of educators from all around the world coming and visiting us every year. We wrote faculty books, and basically it was a wonderful tool not only for kid growth, but for teacher growth. And then the last thing I'll say on that is that when I would give presentations on multiple intelligences, people would say, wow, these intelligences are all great. And I'd say they all are, but there's a however. My however is that while all of the intelligences are important, I believe that the personal intelligences, intrapersonal, knowing yourself, and interpersonal, knowing other people, are really the key to success in life. And that was before Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, was published. That kind of reframed things. Then we've had other books, Carol Dweck, which really, the mindset, I think, falls into the personal intelligences. And then the book that I wrote, to which Tammy referred, The Formative Five, in many ways is an outgrowth of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that background. So just, you spoke a bit about some of the background there with and the work that you had done. Just thinking about all of that work and kind of speaking comparatively, how is the work that teachers have to do similar and different, I guess, from school leaders if you're teaching through multiple intelligences to reach the whole child?
Well, in my perspective, a multiple intelligence perspective, the key is that it causes teachers, if you will, forces teachers to begin looking more idiosyncratically at kids' strengths, which I think is wonderful. Schools too often have a linguistic, logical, mathematical, what I call the scholastic intelligences pathways. And again, if you're good in those intelligences, you're going to do well in school. But lots of kids have strengths in other ways. And an example that I often use, in our fifth grade, these would be kids who are 10 and 11 years old, we would look at the settlement of the United States from colonial America, Civil War, Civil War. And many schools in the U.S., children that age, do that same kind of thing. But what happens is they study it, and it always comes down to writing about it. You show what you know by what you write. And again, often if you're a good writer, you do well, and if you're not a good writer, less so. So we had kids read and write. Don't misunderstand me. It is a very important skill. Kids need to learn it. Semicolon, however, comma. We also gave children other ways to show what they know. So kids could build models. I was in a class once, and the teacher studying the Civil War, teacher handed children note cards, and you got one that said you were a slave owner, a Quaker, a merchant, a northern person. So we got these cards, and then they had to sit in a group and present a script, a play, based on how these characters felt. So it was wonderful that you could get kids understanding without causing them to have to write and do it. I also saw a group of boys doing a timeline, a big piece of paper, horizontal line, what happened in the north, what happened in the south, and they did it spatially. And again, what you're doing, if you're a teacher, is saying, how do children learn? How can I modify my curriculum to give children more ways to show what they know? How can I, as a teacher, modify my curriculum to use more ways, more intelligences in instruction? The feedback I got from teachers, and we did this for 30 years, first of all, they all said, it's a lot of work, but they all said they really liked it. Too often, I think teachers feel like they're performing a script on a stage. People go into teaching because they want to help kids, because they're creative, they want to be doing exciting things. And what a multiple intelligences approach does is say, hey, you decide what works for the kid, and you come up with a way to do it. Last piece on that is a wonderful book to which I often refer, is Roland Barthes' book, Improving Schools from Within. And the case he made is collegiality is the most important factor in determining a school's success. And the children are to go and learn, the adults must go and learn. And what we found was that pursuing multiple intelligences really facilitated the collegiality in our school. We had far fewer occasions where teachers are doing great things with the door closed. What we found is that teachers are doing great things by working with, learning from, teaching their peers. And so they went home tired because they had worked their tails off, but they went home excited because they were really making a difference in kids' lives, and they themselves are growing.
That's
Very
great.
valuable. Thank
That's
you
great.
for the examples.
So, Tom, when you became a school leader, what was it like building a school with this vision?
Well, I initially became a public school principal at age 32. And the good thing was I was so young I didn't know what I didn't know. And all of a sudden I was, if you will, teaching adults rather than teaching kids. And let me tell you, the adults are harder. Um, but it was a challenging job. And what I really learned is that I needed to do, and I'm still not anywhere near as good as I should have, but I needed to do a better job of listening. When I first began leading a school, I really came in and thought, wow, I've got the answers. Well, I did have the answers, but they weren't the right answers. The right answers, by definition, came from people working collaboratively. So I think I became a better listener. It's still something on which I work all the time. And what I found was that being a school leader, you really appreciate teachers who make a difference in kids' lives. When I ran the New City School, my multiple intelligences school in St. Louis, as Tammy said, I did that for 34 years, a long time. And I would often run into parents at the grocery store, and they would say, I love New City School. Well, they didn't really love the building. The bricks weren't particularly exciting. They didn't love the curriculum. It wasn't me. What they really were saying to me is my child had a great teacher, followed by a wonderful teacher, followed by a super teacher. And it seems to me my job as a leader of the school is to do whatever I can to help teachers grow. That's often supporting them, sometimes it's challenging them, but basically it's letting them know that I'm there for them.
That's great.
Wonderful.
So, Tom, can you tell how this work lead to the formative five?
Well, when I was looking at our school, and I think like everybody does, whether you're a teacher, a school leader, the secretary, the maintenance person, you stop and you reflect and you think, what are we doing well? What's right? And one of the things I began noticing was that too often we didn't give enough attention to children's personal intelligences. This is when we got into MI. And it's interesting to me, kids come to school as kindergartners, as first graders, and they're different on the ability to read. And we accept that, gosh, our job is to help every child become a good reader. Now, they don't all make it, but we take that as our task. But somehow we were not taking that same attitude. Our job is to help every child be a good person. Our job is to help every child become somebody who cares about other people. So I began looking at that, and I began looking at the kids I had who graduated. And New City School was an elementary school. We went to grade 6, but I was there long enough that I had kids that I knew as third graders who were 35 years old. And one of the things I began to see was that, and this is exactly what Angela Duckworth talked about when she wrote her book on grit, is that often the kids who we predicted to have the best trajectory in life weren't really the ones who had the best trajectory. The best trajectory, and I'm not talking about earnings here, I'm talking about making a difference in the world and being a good person, for people who had the good personal intelligences, if you will. So I did lots of reading, lots of talking, visiting schools, and I came up with what I call the Formative Five, and that's what Tammy heard me present. And basically what I said is that if we want to do the right thing for children, we need to prepare them to succeed in life, not just to do well in school. They need to do well in school, absolutely, but that's semicolon. However, comma, we need to be looking at how they're going to do in life, what kind of people they're going to be, not only when they're 8 or 18, but 38 and 48 and 58. So the Formative Five that I identified are empathy, self-control, integrity, embracing diversity, and grit. And my book was basically saying, these are the Formative Five. Here's what they mean. Here's why they're important. And here's what teachers and principals can do to facilitate those being developed. I call them skills in our classrooms and in our schools.
That's great.
Thank you. So having this kind of, I guess I would call it a framework. How do you see, or how did you see in your school that work kind of take shape and change the existing culture that was in your building and other schools as well that you work with?
That's the key question. You use the term culture, and absolutely. So that if a school, or if a teacher, because I'm talking about this on a school-wide basis, but there are often teachers who do it. If a teacher does this, what needs to happen is, first of all, you've got to say it's important, and you've got to allow the time for it. This is not something that can happen without giving it an allocation of time. So I talk about time. I also talk about monitoring progress, and I don't like the word assessment because too often people think that means a lettered way to a number. That's not what I'm talking about. Right. But, as Grant Wiggins said, what you measure is what you value. And so if we really believe in the personal intelligence, my Formative Five, if we believe in those, what we need to do is talk about them, be able to look at what kids are doing differently, be able to share their progress with parents. So the first thing I talked about is time. The second thing is measuring progress. And the third thing is communicating. This needs to be out there in the parent community. In my book, I've talked about developing rubrics. And it seems to me the best rubrics are those in which kids have input. And in my perfect classroom for the Formative Five, I would have those 5 rubrics around the room. And I would say to the kids, let's look at this, let's talk about this, what does this look like? While I'm rambling here, let me give you one more thought. And this is something that I think
ramble away.
really exciting. We'll talk. I've got a new book, and so this is so cool. I can't wait to share. All right. So anyway, so what has happened, and this is a revelation, and I'm embarrassed to admit that at this age in life, it has finally dawned on me. All of the years that I taught, and I was a teacher, and all of the years that I was leading schools, the day before kids would come, or the night before, every teacher was in his or her room, furiously getting it ready. And so on that first day, the kids came, the first day of school, every kid's gifted, and they walked in, and the classroom was beautiful, it was just decorated, and everybody was so proud of that, and it has dawned on me, that's a mistake. And it's a mistake because that is in the teacher's classroom, not the community classroom, not the kids' classroom. So what I'm now advocating is absolutely go in, get it ready, but don't have it finished. Give kids an opportunity to put themselves in that classroom. Every classroom, I would argue, should have kid input. I would have a space for kid photos. You say to them on the first day, we want you to bring a photo of your family, whatever that family is, however you wanted to define it. Some kids are going to bring a photo of them, including the dog. That's cool. Some kids are going to have grandparents. That's great. But I want a kid imprint in their classroom. So when we come back to your question about what we need to do for the Formative Five, we need to make sure we have time allocated. That's not only time during the day, faculty meetings, professional development sessions need to have time focused specifically on that. And I'm giving a presentation in Orlando in June, basically about social emotional learning, ASCD conference. And the title is something like Don't Leapfrog the Teachers. And what I mean by that is that we can't do this to kids, we do this with kids. When we do this with kids, teachers have to be engaged in this too. School that I'm running, teachers are also going to be developing their empathy, self-control, integrity, embracing of diversity and grit. So we've got to give that time. We've got to find a way to measure, capture progress, so we know what kids need and where we're making a difference. And number 3, we've got to find a way to share this with the community, to report it out, to bring them so that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that.
Thank you, Tom, for so bravely answering the questions. Now, before we move on to the next question, and I would like to tell the viewers that they can comment, they can ask the questions, and we'll pick the question. And Tom will love to answer the questions. Am I right, Tom? He will. So you can ask questions. Yeah, even Tammy will love to answer the question if there is any questions from Tammy. So my question is, Tom, there is a very serious thing about these new ideas. Like most of the people have read Howard Gardner and about the multiple intelligence, and your book as well. And you mentioned Grant Wiggins and his work. And when I was doing my the certification in understanding by design, apparently the things look very fancy. And yes, it works as well. It works really powerfully. But Tom, social emotional learning is a relatively new idea. and especially for those education models which are still struggling to get mature in terms of practices and facing challenges due to the cultural norms. I want you to shed some light how social and emotional learning looks like at a school, and if you quote some examples how the challenges can be addressed, especially like you have the exposure of working with several cultures and several countries and several people, how those cultures can who are struggling can embed social emotional learning in their classrooms.
So, wonderful. And let me start off by saying that, and I'm talking about social emotional learning, but I think irrespective of the topic, if you will, the key, I think, to school change, and I talked earlier about collaboration, teachers and administrators working together.
Yeah,
I'm a big advocate of book groups. Very little do we do without having a voluntary book group at my school. And what that meant is I would have maybe a quarter to a third of the people who would opt in. And when I talk about change, I think of concentric circles. Here I am, here's that group, and here's the faculty, and we would ripple out. And so many of the issues that we talked about, we read the books to which you referred. I think we probably read all of them in a faculty book group. And then how that plays out, let me give you a little simple example. And it's one of those things that is common sense, but it's not common, is we talk about engagement, which is what everybody wants. We talk about how that leads to empathy, if you will. Too often in schools, and as Tammy said, I'm working at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Been working with the principal preparation program. So I go visit 30 schools a year. I'll go in and I'll meet with my students. These are young people working on a master's degree. And I'll go in and often I meet with the principal and the teacher. And it amazes me how sometimes I'll walk in a school. Here I'm an adult and another adult is coming my way. They don't make eye contact. They don't say hi. There's not a friendly greeting. I'm like, hold on a second. Well, years ago, we talked about this at my school, and my school wasn't perfect either. And one of the things we came up with was the 10-foot rule. And the 10-foot rule is that when you're walking down the hall, when there's another person who's within 10 feet of you, you do what? You look up, you make eye contact, and you say hi. And that's just the norm. And it's a little simple thing, but I talked about it at faculty meetings, I talked about it at parent meetings that are back to school night. I said to parents, we're going to do this, and we want you to do this too. And I got to tell you, that little bitty thing really made a difference in terms of how it felt to be in the school. It was another reminder that we're a community. We're not just a bunch of people engaged in a transaction. So that was really powerful. The other thing that I talked about is that when we began implementing social emotional learning, and back then at my school, it was the personal intelligence. The Formative Five is a book I've written now that I'm out, but it is being talked about in other schools. I visited schools in Maryland, in Iowa, in Tennessee, in St. Louis, all of whom are doing Formative Five. Talked on the phone with a principal of a school in Washington, school in Texas doing the same kinds of things. What they're doing is lots and lots of signage. And I wrote an article, and this is the kind of thing, if your readers would email me or you, however you want to do it. As Tammy said, I wrote a column on educational leadership called The Principal Connection for 14 years. And one of my favorite columns was The Schoolhouse at Midnight. And the premise was that aliens come and take you, aliens from outer space, aliens, not from other country aliens. They take you to your schoolhouse and turn on the lights. What do you see when you walk around and look at the halls and walls? What's the messages? And it seems to me that those messages should reflect who we are and what we believe. Too often, I see halls that are pretty vacant. Well, that's a wasted opportunity. Sometimes I see halls and there's lots of kids' stuff up, and that's good. But when I look at it, my sense is that stuff represents the top 10, maybe 20% of kids. There are lots of children who aren't good enough in art, who aren't strong enough academically to get their work on the wall. And it seems to me that whether I'm a school leader or whether I'm a teacher looking at the wall right outside my door, what I need to be thinking is, what can I do? I want to reward the kids who are excellent, absolutely. But what can I also do to reward the kids who are struggling but doing better? What can I do to reward the kids who aren't really good, but it's the best they can do? And so it seems to me, when you talk about what we can do, little things that are really big things, like what's on our halls, what's on our walls, how we interact on a casual basis. can really do a lot to set the tone for a school.
Mm-hmm. I think you just kind of mentioned a couple of things that I was going to ask you what advice you can offer to school leaders and teachers to support the work and, showcasing all kids. And so using the walls is one way to do that, which I think is so important. I just hosted some school leaders here from Manila, and we did a school visit, and it was the school I used to teach at here. And they were amazed at all of the work on the walls. And some of it is, finished product. A lot of it is process work. So everybody's pictures are up with different pieces. And one of the comments was just, the utter amazement of the amount of student presence on the walls, because in their schools, they have to have clean white walls. So
good for you.
It's just really interesting. It changes the feel of the building when you've got student stuff everywhere versus something that's like a blank canvas almost. So are there other ways, maybe one or two pieces of advice that you could give to people besides using the walls, which is a huge thing, I think?
Well, let me give you one more suggestion. Often when I do presentations, and like you all, I travel around the world and I do presentations. Often when I do that, and I'm talking about social emotional learning, I'm talking about the Formative Five, a question will be, I understand this, but my kids' parents aren't there. They're still in I want to get my child into Harvard, she's a kindergartner, what do I do? And I hear that, I have that tension too. And so what I've talked about are some strategies we can do to help parents see the value of this. And so what I did a couple times in my back to school night, and this was an evening, several evenings, we would have start of school in September. Parents would all come because they want to hear what's going to be happening in their child's classroom. And we would first meet in the theater, and I'd have them for about 20 minutes before they went to classrooms. And a couple times, years apart, people came in, and as they entered the theater, they were given a blank 3x5 card. And, they looked at the card, what is this? And so they sat down, I greeted them. I talked about that it was going to be a good school year. And I said, before we go any further, I've got a test for you. Everybody, kind of, what do you mean a test? I said, but it's going to be a good test. What I want you to do, write down on that card the initials of 3 people people you know personally, who you think are successful in life. And so they would write down, I'd give them 60 seconds. And then I said, okay, turn to your neighbors, groups of 3 or 4. And if you're with somebody, if you can, turn so that you're in a different group. And what I want you to talk about is not who those people are, but what were the criteria that caused you to listen? What are the characteristics they share? Well, the crowd would begin talking. I'd say, I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes. Well, inevitably, I couldn't get them to stop talking because it was such an exciting discussion. And they would come back and I would say, okay, if there was anything that everybody in your group agreed on, just raise your hand. What was it? And folks would yell out. Well, inevitably, the kinds of things they discussed are social emotional. Nobody said, oh, these are people who are really great writers. These are people who know the atomic scale. What they said is, these are people who listen well. These are people who are trustable. These are people who are leaders because people know they give good advice. These are people who are kind. These are people who are all that kind of stuff. And I would basically take those and I write them down and I say, great. I said, you all are so smart because you are ahead of us. You're telling us this is what we're going to work on this year. And that allowed me to then move into the Formative Five as a way of saying, this is something that reflects your values. This is something that you want to do. So that would be one piece. The other bit of advice I would give, and this is advice for school leaders, but it's also applicable to teachers. One of the problems in education, I think, is that no matter how much we do, no matter how well we do it, no matter how quickly we do it, there's always more to be done. And it makes it very hard to prioritize. And I think sitting down at the beginning of the school year and setting your goals and saying, this is what I want to work on, this is my academic goal. What I would say is that you also have a social emotional goal. And this should be something that we're going to work on. And I'm really open to what that might be. It could be that the teacher says, my social emotional goal is that this year we're going to work on empathy in the classroom. Great. When I talk about the Formative Five, a mistake that I don't want people to make is trying to do all 5 at once. If you did 1 a month, or if you spent the whole year on integrity, that would be great. But if I'm a teacher, if I'm a school saying this is what I'm going to work on, because if you say this is going to be my goal, that then leads to, okay, how are you going to know that you were successful? What does that look like? What's the baseline? What's happening? Okay, not a test score, not a number, a process objective. You know you're successful because you spent time on it. You're going to build in student reflection. What are you going to do to convey this to parents? If I walked in your classroom, if I walked in your school, how would I know that this was important? So basically, it's taking the kinds of things that too often I think we work on our own and raising it to a level of visibility. And again, if you walk in my classroom in my school and you see empathy, I will guarantee if another teacher walks in, that's going to lead to a discussion about empathy. If parents come in, that's going to say something. And when I talk about the Formative Five, I talk about intentionality and transparency. Again, we don't do this to kids, we do this with them. So the more visible, the more aware, the better. To back up, if I'm going to do the 10-foot rule, I don't say we're doing it just because it's people being nice. I say empathy is really important, and a base of empathy is really knowing other people. And I believe that by saying hi to folks, that's going to lead to conversations, that's going to lead to comfort, and that's going to develop empathy. So again, that's part of the transparency. Here's why we're doing it.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you, Tom, for such a brief and detailed, not brief actually, it's a detailed answer. Okay, my question is, Tom, when working internationally, what are some things you keep in mind when working with leaders from different countries and different cultures?
Well, people in different countries coming together is always interesting because the cultures are very different in how schools are organized and how countries and cultures are organized. So I think there, if I'm talking to leaders, the key, not unlike I mentioned earlier, is listening to people, finding out what their needs are, what their perceptions are. I really believe if we're talking about educating children, we have much more in common than we sometimes think. But the key is stepping back and asking, what are the constraints? What are the issues that are challenging you? In my book, one of the things when I talked about self-control, when I talked about kids, and I'm going to come back to principals, when I talked about kids, many teachers will work on developing self-control in children. I get that. But too often we don't help the children anticipate what are going to be the barriers, what are the obstacles, what do you need to overcome. And it seems to me the same is true in working with school leaders. If I've got school leaders or you have school leaders, whoever, and we're going to talk with them about a school that develops empathy, for example, self-control, integrity, embracing diversity, and grit. One of the beginning questions is, what are the obstacles? What's going to make it hard? What are your challenges? And if we sit down and we look at those, I think we can find ways around it. But too often, the obstacles we don't think about because they're there all the time. We're not aware of them.
That's great. That's great. Okay, so what are you reading at the moment?
Well, I've just started David Brooks' new book called The Second Mountain. And David Brooks is I wanted to say a political writer, but he really writes more about human development than politics. And he basically says that the first mountain in our life is the mountain of achievement. We want to get ahead, we want to get degrees, we want to make a dent in the world. And the second mountain, he would argue, is relationships, making relationships with people, becoming the kind of person you are. And I think that has applicability. I'm also reading Robert Greenleaf's book, Servant Leadership, which is 30 or 40 years old, and teaching a class this summer, co-teaching, basically developing virtue in leaders. And the idea is that the principals developing virtue, prospective principals, so they can do this with their teachers. So the Brooks book, the Greenleaf book are really powerful for helping me reflect on what I need to do a better job, to help these people do a better job in learning with the teachers.
That's great.
Thank you. Awesome. We like to, I like to just kind of drop a comment to our viewers on YouTube what people are reading. So if they need some suggestions, that's where those will be. So we'll post those in the YouTube comment. So we're getting ready to wrap up our show. Was there any questions from the viewers, Umair, that you wanted to address?
No, people are just appreciating. Many people are appreciating Tom. and they are happy. They agree with the answers, and it's a powerful, convincing power. And some of my students have been popped up, and they started praising me. I don't know why. Suddenly, out of blue, they started saying good things about me. But it happens. So yeah,
That's good. That's
we are
nice.
all good. Yeah. So
Good. Okay.
let's move on. And Tammy, you shared the quote, and we move to the closing. Yeah.
Yeah. So usually we end the show with a quote. And so, Tom, I was wondering if you have one of your favorite quotes that you would like to share with our viewers.
Yeah.
Well,
Nice.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Share your quote.
Yeah, your favorite quote.
One of my favorite quote is Winston Churchill, who says, "Success is to go from failure to failure with enthusiasm." And it seems to me that's what it's all about. I mean, however knowledgeable I am, I sound better. And whatever I've done because I made mistake after mistake, but I didn't give up. And it seems to me, particularly when we're talking about the kind of educational change that we need, we've got to be courageous and intrepid and know we're going to make mistakes. And that's okay. We're going to put our head down and move forward.
Yeah, agreed. It's a learning process and a journey, and takes a long time to get where we want to go. So thank you very much, Tom, for joining us. It's been a great conversation. We're going to post. Thanks very much. We're going to
and we are going to end this today's show. But before we end up the show, Tom, thank you very much. We need hours and hours to sit with you and learn a lot from you. You have huge knowledge, and your work is really commendable.
Well, we're all doing good stuff, trying to do the same thing, and I'm happy to help.
Thank you very much. And I would like to share this thing with the viewers that you should get the book Formative Five and learn from it. And there is a huge work going on social emotional learning and school culture. Tom, thank you once again for your time. Thank you, Tammy. We are going off here, and you can watch the show later on YouTube channel as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Good night. Good day.
Bye.
Good night. Bye. Have a good day.